A very good evening, dear students. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu news analysis. So today is 22nd April 2025, and today we have some very important articles for the discussion. And one by one, we'll try to discuss all these important articles in a very detailed manner. And we are going to start this discussion with the first very important topic. It is about India and Saudi Arabia relations. And in fact, India and Saudi Arabia relations have spanned from different areas, whether it is energy, whether it is trade, commerce, cultural ties, people-to-people ties, and Indian people working in the Middle East, particularly in Saudi Arabia, and remittances that India receives, and Saudi Arabia's investments in India's infrastructure. So therefore, there are number of areas where India and Saudi Arabia have been working on bilaterally and multilaterally. Now, in this context, we will be understanding India and Saudi Arabia relations in a very detailed manner. Now, what is the context of this particular article that has been given in the Indian Express? So it is given in Indian Express newspaper, and in fact, this is all you know that very important for your General Studies paper 2 mains examination, international relations. The context is that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going to visit Saudi Arabia, and in fact the objective and the aim of this visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi is to strengthen the bilateral relations between India and Saudi Arabia. Remember, both India and Saudi Arabia already have the strategic partnership, and this visit is going to further strengthen the strategic partnership between both India and Saudi Arabia. However, it is also expected that both India and Saudi Arabia will also sign number of agreements in the areas of trade, defense, investments under the Strategic Partnership Council framework. So there will be a Strategic Partnership Council framework between these two countries, and they are going to further deepen their relationship with the Strategic Partnership Council framework. Now, you can see here the location of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's location is very important for your prelims examination. The reason is, in recent times, Red Sea has emerged as a volatile region, and ships which are passing through the Red Sea are very often and frequently attacked. And in fact, Red Sea is also considered as one of the maritime choke points, and it is also a very important area of concern for many countries, including India. Now, in this context, for the maritime security, also another important area where India and Saudi Arabia can work on, right? So in this context, we'll try to briefly understand the history of India and Saudi Arabia relations first. So both these countries have begun the formal diplomatic relations way back in the year 1947. So when India became independent, so at that time itself, both India and Saudi Arabia have established their formal diplomatic relations with each other. However, the major milestones, if you can look into between India and Saudi Arabia, so Delhi Declaration has been signed when King Abdullah had visited India, and that had laid the foundation for the strategic partnership between India and Saudi Arabia. Remember that Delhi Declaration laid the foundation for the strategic partnership between India and Saudi Arabia, and that has further helped deepen and also strengthen the bilateral relations between both India and Saudi Arabia. And similarly, another important declaration that has been signed by both countries is Riyadh Declaration 2010. So this Riyadh Declaration 2010 was signed during Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's visit to Saudi Arabia, and that had further elevated the bilateral relationship between India and Saudi Arabia. So it has brought in the strategic dimension between these two countries. However, if you carefully observe the recent bilateral relations and the developments in the relations between India and Saudi Arabia. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi had a visit to Saudi Arabia in the year 2016, 2019 and even 2025 also. A visit is expected from Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Saudi Arabia. However, the key focus of this visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi is on energy, defense, space and culture. So these are the main areas and these are considered as the pillars of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Saudi Arabia. And in fact, Saudi's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's visit to India in the year 2019 and 2023 had further deepened the relations between these two countries. And in fact, one thing that you should understand here is that in Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Saudi Arabia is a very important trade partner for India. So you can see here within the Gulf region, UAE is the top trading partner for India, followed by Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia within the Gulf region, the second largest trade partner for India. Right? So in fact, overall, Saudi Arabia is the fourth largest trade partner for India, and that much of a significance that we have with respect to Saudi Arabia. And apart from that, you can also see the other countries trade with India as well. However, location of Saudi Arabia is very important. Saudi Arabia shares its borders with Yemen, Oman, UAE, Qatar and Bahrain, even Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan as well. Right? So this is Red Sea. So you have to remember that this is a Red Sea and this is Bab al-Mandab and this is Gulf of Aden. So this is what is called as Gulf of Aden. This is Bab al-Mandab, this is Red Sea, and this region is a Gulf of Aqaba that you should have to remember, and other countries which shares borders with the Saudi Arabia as well. And apart from that, now what are the opportunities between India and Saudi Arabia relations? So we should also look into the opportunities that we have so that we can further capitalize, we can further strengthen our bilateral relations with each other. So firstly, we need to look into the economic aspect as well, right? So probably the data that we have seen previously is a bit old data, but financial year 23-24, Saudi Arabia is the fifth largest trading partner for India, right? So in fact, fifth largest means that it is huge, right? So we have China and US as the first and second largest trading partners for us. So therefore, fifth largest trading partner, the total bilateral trade between India and Saudi Arabia stands at 42.98 billion US dollars in the financial year 23-24. And apart from that, there is a huge investment opportunity for both countries, both India and Saudi Arabia as well. So including a US dollars of 10 billion investment in possible sectors like retail, technology, agriculture, real estate. So these are a number of areas where Saudi Arabia can invest in India, and India can also invest in Saudi Arabia. So therefore, mutually there are a lot of opportunities for both these countries to invest in each other's countries. And energy cooperation is also another very important dimension. So when we talk about energy, as I have already told you, that India has been importing about 85% of the fossil fuels from the other countries, right? And in fact, Saudi Arabia is a very important source of fossil fuels for India, right? So Saudi Arabia as of now the third largest crude oil supplier for India, and in fact Saudi Arabia is also contributing around a 3% of India's total oil imports 23-24. So therefore, for energy security of India, Saudi Arabia is very important. Yes, we are working on renewable energy resources, but renewable energy resources are also having certain shortcomings. For example, the intermittent nature of the renewable energy resources, and renewable energy resources required a long-term development. So therefore, we need fossil fuels as of now to sustain our economic growth and economic development. So for that, we need countries like Saudi Arabia to ensure India's energy security. And similarly, we all knew that India, along with France, launched International Solar Alliance, and majority of the countries in the Middle East are part of the International Solar Alliance. Similarly, Saudi Arabia is also joined the International Solar Alliance. So therefore, both India and Saudi Arabia are actively collaborating in the area of renewables and renewable energy technologies as well. So this could likely strengthen the relations between both these countries. However, security, defense is another very important dimension between the relations of these two countries, and India is very well known as the net security provider in the region. So since India is known as a net security provider in the region, both India and Saudi Arabia regularly conduct naval exercises like Al-Muhad Al-Hindi and joint land forces exercise such as exercise Sada Tansik I that has held in 2024. So remember that we have already discussed about number of exercises, and this is another very important exercise. Remember, all these exercises are being asked in your prelims examination, so therefore you have to be extra focused here. And apart from that, the cultural and people-to-people linkages are also another very important dimension of relations between both India and Saudi Arabia, because as it is said that on an average 7 million Indian diaspora have been living in Saudi Arabia, and they are actually acting as a very important socio-economic bridge between these two countries. And in fact, both India and Saudi Arabia already signed cultural memorandum of understandings in the areas of yoga cooperation, growing tourism, and even the sports engagement as well. So this has been indicating that there is a growing cultural cooperation between both these countries. However, these two countries already achieved the strategic convergence, and they would like to further deepen and further elevate this strategic convergence. So therefore, alignment between Vision 2030 Saudi Arabia and Vikasit Bharat 2047 India actually fosters a synergies in infrastructure, innovation, human capital development, all these different areas. So therefore, these are existing opportunities for India and Saudi Arabia larger cooperation. However, it is not free from the challenges. There are various challenges in India and Saudi Arabia relations. So let's have a look into the challenges in the relations between these two countries. So firstly, Saudi Arabia is located in the Middle East, and Middle East is very well known for the geopolitical instability and volatility in the region. So this is particularly due to the regional conflicts in the Middle East, for example, Israel and Hamas war, and even war or civil war in Yemen, and Iran and Saudi Arabia tension. So all these different things have resulted in a geopolitical instability in Middle East, and this is one area where it has been impacting the relations of India and Saudi Arabia, because India need to balance its interests with the multiple partners in the Middle East. So therefore, this is the first concern. And the second concern is the heavy competition with China in the Middle East, because China already made a deep inroads into the Middle East. However, India is also competing with China in the Middle East. However, Saudi Arabia's parallel engagement with both China and India, including the BRICS Plus, could actually create a strategic balancing challenges for India as well, right? So however, one thing that we should remember here, traditionally BRICS is known as a grouping of 5 different countries, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So however, what happened was in 2024 BRICS expanded and BRICS become a BRICS Plus grouping. So in the expanded BRICS Plus grouping, different countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia became members of the BRICS grouping. However, the other thing that you should remember, in 2025 Indonesia also also formally became the member of the BRICS grouping. So therefore, since India and China and Saudi Arabia are members of the BRICS grouping, and huge competition with China within Middle East would actually create a strategic balancing challenges for India in short term and long term as well. However, the other very important aspect that we should understand is a huge oil dependence of India in Middle East in general and Saudi Arabia in particular, because India is heavily dependent on Saudi's oil. So India's dependence is around 14.3%. So therefore, India's such a heavy dependence on Saudi's oil would make it more and more vulnerable to energy market fluctuations in the long term. And apart from that, there are also issues related to the rights and welfare of the Indian workers who are working in Saudi Arabia, and these issues are also occasionally surface, and therefore it actually requires a sustained consular intervention as well as a detailed dialogue between both India and Saudi Arabia. So therefore, the workers' rights can be protected and workers' interests can also be protected in Saudi Arabia. And apart from that, there are certain cultural sensitivities also. So these cultural sensitivities also emerge as a key challenge between the relations of India and Saudi Arabia, right? So there are reforms in Saudi Arabia, like navigating, women are given driving licenses. So therefore, a lot of religious reforms, social reforms are being carried out by the current ruler of Saudi Arabia. However, in this context, India navigating religious and cultural norms remains a delicate for expanding the people to people relations, right? So for India, expanding people to people relations is very, very important with Saudi Arabia. So these are some of the challenges in the bilateral relations between both India and Saudi Arabia. So what should be the way forward in this context? The way forward is, first, India should look to diversify the economic cooperation with Saudi Arabia. So there are a number of areas, and India should start looking at those different areas and further strengthen the cooperation with Saudi Arabia into all these different areas, because there are different areas like fintech, renewable energy, food security, and digital economy. So India can work with Saudi Arabia in all these different areas, and these areas have a huge potential. And secondly, strengthening the defense and security ties is also very, very important. Remember, as I have already told you, that India is known as the net security provider in the region, and India is also having the capability and capacity to ensure the defense and security in the region. So therefore, India should actually look to enhance defense cooperation in the areas of defense production, cybersecurity, counter-terrorism, and training. So bilateral military exercises, naval exercises are already conducted by both the forces of Saudi Arabia and India. So this is a good step taken by both these countries. And similarly, there is a need to promote people to people connect as well. So people to people connect is very important for cultural relations, for further strengthening the soft power, goodwill among the people of both these countries, and it would actually lay down the long-term relations between these two countries. So therefore, expanding the educational exchanges, cultural festivals, tourism promotion, so is very, very important for better India and Saudi Arabia relations. And apart from that, Saudi Arabia recently have the vision of 2030. So altogether completely change the structure of the Saudi Arabia, right? So Saudi Arabia as of now known to depend excessively on fossil fuels. So therefore, by Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia has been looking to diversify its economy. So Saudi Arabia has even started Invest Saudi Arabia mega projects such as a Neom City, and there are number of emerging sectors such as entertainment, tourism, real estate, and it actually provides a lot of opportunities for India to invest, to strengthen its relations with the Saudi Arabia. And multilateral relations and multilateralism, multilateral groupings is also another very important area. So therefore, both India and Saudi Arabia can work very, very closely in multilateral platforms. So in multilateral platforms, in the sense that both India and Saudi Arabia are already members in the G20 grouping, and they are already members in the BRICS Plus grouping and also the International Solar Alliance. So therefore, both these countries can work in these multilateral platforms and in regional forums to push a multipolar and a rules-based global order, and that will mutually benefit both India and Saudi Arabia as a regional powers. And in fact, on this image, you can also see India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. And in fact, this India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor is expected to further strengthen the relations between both India and Saudi Arabia as well, right? So if it is capitalized, it would certainly strengthen the relations between these two countries. So I hope you have understood. And the next important topic, so recently we have been coming across a number of news articles which are talking about the powers of the governor when it comes to giving assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies. And recently what happened was the Tamil Nadu State Legislative Assembly passed certain bills, and those bills were sent to the governor for his assent. However, under Article 200 of the Indian Constitution, governor has certain options when the State Legislative Assembly presented bills for him, right? So the options are, he can withhold assent to the bill, and he can give his assent to the bill, and he can send the bill for the reconsideration of the State Legislative Assembly, and he can even reserve the bill for the consideration of the president, right? So in this case, what happened was Tamil Nadu state government has approached the Supreme Court because governor is not giving assent to the bills. He just withhold assent to the bills, and that has been impacting the governance process in the state, and because of that reason Tamil Nadu has approached the Supreme Court. However, the Supreme Court has set a time frame using Article 142 of the Indian Constitution. So under Article 142 of the Indian Constitution, the Supreme Court has issued directions to both governor as well as the president, and Supreme Court set timelines to give assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies. However, some legal experts have hailed this judgment. However, individuals like Vice President Mr. Jagdeep Dhankar, they've criticized this judgment of the Supreme Court, because judgment of the Supreme Court amounts to the judicial overreach. So it is not just judicial activism, but it is amounting to the judicial overreach. So we'll understand what are the shortcomings in the judiciary and why Vice President has been criticizing judiciary for this order. So Vice President Mr. Jagdeep Dhankar recently raised certain issues with respect to the independence of the judiciary, and he in fact said that in India, legislature and executive has the accountability mechanisms, but judiciary is lacking the accountability mechanisms. And in fact, he also questioned the independence of the judiciary as well. So I would like to tell you one example here. The 99th Constitutional Amendment Act has been passed by the Parliament. This is also called as National Judicial Appointments Commission. However, the Supreme Court has declared the National Judicial Appointments Commission as unconstitutional. Supreme Court struck down this as unconstitutional because it has been violating the independence of the judiciary, right? So however, as of now, the appointments and transfers to the higher judiciary is being done through the collegium system alone. So therefore, it has been impacting, or he raised questions on the independence of the judiciary and also the powers of the Supreme Court or the judiciary of its judicial review, and also judgment of the Supreme Court prescribing time limits for both governor and the president. And in fact, the overall role of the judiciary in any constitutional democracy. So Indian judiciary is a constitutionally placed as the guardian of the constitution and the rights of the citizens. Now one thing that you should understand here is that UPSC already asked a question that who among the following are known as the guardian of the constitution. So there are options like the Supreme Court, the Parliament, the President, and even a Prime Minister or something like that. So therefore Supreme Court is known as the guardian of the constitution, and Supreme Court is also the guardian of the rights of the citizens. So Supreme Court enjoys a certain rights. However, recently what happened was Supreme Court exercises a wider powers through the mechanisms, right? So it has certain mechanisms, and through those mechanisms Supreme Court also exercises a wider powers, such as judicial review under Article 142 of the Indian Constitution. So this Article 142 of the Indian Constitution, so this gives a wider powers to the court. So Article 142 says that the Supreme Court can order anything, can pass decrees to do complete justice in any matter, right? So Article 142 to uphold justice and also ensure accountability, including for the executive. However, its role has been occasionally sparked a debate, right? So the overall role of the judiciary, and in recent times judiciary very often using Article 142 has occasionally sparked a debate as well, particularly concerning its perceived lack of transparency and even the scope of its powers as well. And in fact, Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar, he also raised serious concerns regarding various facets of the Indian judiciary's functioning, and therefore it has led to a widespread discussion in India about the role of the judiciary, whether the recent judgment of the judiciary amounts to the judicial overreach or the judicial activism, or the judiciary worked within its own jurisdiction. However, Mr. Jagdeep Dhankar criticized the opaque nature of internal inquiries into the judicial misconduct, right? So, the judicial misconduct, the Supreme Court has ordered an internal inquiry in recent issue of a huge amount of cash in the state of, burning has been found in the judge of the Delhi High Court, right? So in this context, he especially made a reference to an incident involving the recovery of large amounts of cash from a judge of Delhi High Court, right? So therefore, Jagdeep Dhankar also questioned the recent Supreme Court judgment that directed certain timelines, and these timelines are imposed by the Supreme Court on the governor and the president when it comes to the giving assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies, right? So the timelines actually look like this. So 1 month of timeline for withholding assent or reserving for the president, right? So the governor must act within 1 month when it comes to withholding his assent to the bill or reserving for the president. And Supreme Court has also given 3 months of time limit when it comes to returning the bill for the reconsideration of the state legislative assembly. And in fact, so the Supreme Court has also given 3-month time for reservation of bills for the president, right? So contrary to the advice tendered by the Council of Ministers, and it must be done within the 3 months, and 1 month for granting assent to represented bills. So it must be done within 1 single month. So these are certain timelines that are prescribed by the Supreme Court in the Constitution. However, Constitution is silent on these timelines. Constitution has not provided any timelines. There is no specific legislation that has been talking about the timelines, right? So therefore these issues are existing, and even Jagdeep Dhankar also questioned the recent Supreme Court judgment that directed timelines for actions by the governors and president on pending state legislations, and even the court had issued a writ mandamus, right? So there are certain writs that can be issued by the Supreme Court and high courts, and one such writ is mandamus. So what is this mandamus writ, right? So mandamus writ actually asks a public servant to perform his duties, right? So that is a writ mandamus, and in this case also the Supreme Court has actually issued a writ mandamus to both governor and even the president as well, right? So the court had issued writ mandamus holding high constitutional offices accountable in cases of undue delay. However, Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar held that there is a lack of accountability in the functioning of the judiciary. So Vice President clearly emphasized that unlike executive and legislature, judiciary is lacking the mechanism that can be directly answerable to the public. So as of now, judiciary is not directly answerable to the people like executive and the judiciary, unlike the executive and judiciary. And he even suggested re-evaluating the provisions of Article 145 Clause 3. Article 145 Clause 3, and that mandates a minimum of 5 judges to adjudicate the constitutional questions. There are certain questions which should be decided by the constitutional benches of the Supreme Court. So 5 judges would sit and hear number of cases, and those benches are called as the constitutional benches of the Supreme Court, right? And apart from that, the use of Article 142. So Article 142 talks about the power of the Supreme Court to do complete justice in any matter. So therefore, Vice President actually opined that sweeping powers under Article 142 are sometimes used in ways that undermine the principles of representative democracy in India. So this is how Mr. Jagdeep Dhankar actually criticized the judiciary for its lack of accountability, and judiciary also stepping into the powers, functions, responsibilities of legislature and executive as well, right? So if you have any other doubts regarding this, so please comment in the comment section, and I would like to answer those questions as well. So the next very important topic is heat wave and India's lack of heat wave action plans. And even if we have heat wave action plans, so those heat wave action plans are not properly implemented in India. So that is the main problem with respect to heat waves. Now, one thing that we should understand here, a country like India, which is having a huge population and a huge population density, and most of its people are vulnerable to intense heat waves. However, in recent times, because of the global warming, because of the climate change, the heat wave intensity and frequency has also been increasing in many parts of our country. So therefore, in this context, it is suggested that India should have a heat wave action plan, and we should not just have a heat wave action plan, so we should also have both short term and a long term strategies which might be part of these heat wave action plans, and we should also implement them in a robust manner. So this is what it has been suggested. So however, if you can understand the context of heat waves, India actually witnessed a severe heat wave in March 2025, around 20 days earlier than the previous year. So therefore, it indicates that there is an increased frequency, increased intensity of heat waves, and it also highlights the need for a short-term and long-term measures and strategies that should be taken as part of the heat wave action plan to tackle the heat stress and its cascading impacts on India and India's vulnerable population. So on this image, it has been clearly given what is and which temperature range is generally considered as a heat wave range, right? So a heat wave scenario, if any plain area experiences a temperature maximum of 40 degrees Celsius or more, and it is being said that that area is experiencing a heat wave situation. However, when it comes to hills, so we all knew that on hills the temperatures would be lower. So on hills, a 30 degrees Celsius or more temperatures would be normally considered as a heat wave scenario, right? So therefore, a 40 degrees Celsius is considered as the normal maximum temperature, and a deviation from this normal maximum temperature of around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius would be considered as a heat wave condition, right? So this is with respect to the plains as well as hills on heat wave. Now, what is the definition of heat wave? So first of all, we'll try to understand the definition of heat wave. So heat wave is actually a prolonged period of excessively hot weather, and I hope most of you have been experiencing the impact of heat waves in India now. So heat wave is actually a prolonged period of excessive hot weather, and it is often accompanied by a high humidity, significantly impacting human health, agriculture, and also the ecosystems as well. So this is the definition of heat wave. So whenever you have been asked a question on heat wave, you simply mention this definition in the answer, right? So first of all, we'll try to understand how a heat wave is being formed, right? So how a heat wave is being formed. So heat wave is mainly formed because of the formation of a high pressure heat dome over a particular region, right? So formation of a high pressure heat dome over a particular region, and this high pressure heat dome would prevent the air near the surface to escape, and because of that reason, air near the ground, near the surface, would continuously heats up over a period of time, for a prolonged period of time, and that would result in a heat wave like condition, right? So in summer, the jet streams normally flow from the west to east, right? So normally moves, the air shifts northwards, and hot and stagnant air expands upwards, and strong and high pressure atmospheric conditions, which combined with influences from La Nina, act like a dome or a cap, right? So this process is known as a convection, and hot air attempts to escape, but high pressure cap acts as a either cap or a lid, and this high pressure region actually pushes back the hot air near the surface. So under the dome, air sinks and compresses, releasing more and more heat as well. So as winds move the hot air east, the jet streams trap the air where it sinks, resulting in a heat wave like a condition, right? The hotter the temperature is, the stronger the heat dome gets, and vice versa actually happens here. So what are the key features of heat wave like conditions? So in India, heat wave is actually declared when maximum temperature exceeds 40 degrees Celsius in plain areas and 30 degrees Celsius in hilly areas. So we have already understood this. However, it is intensified by the factors like humidity, wind speed, and even the urban heat island as well. However, the global warming, climate change, and phenomenons like El Nino and La Nina are also considered as the other major contributors to the increased frequency and intensity of heat wave conditions in India. However, what are the major impacts of heat waves? So that we should try to understand here, right? So it is actually having a detrimental impact on the number of sectors in any country. First of all, it is actually having a worst impact on the health. Now understand one thing, that in India, around 90% of the workforce are engaged in the informal or unorganized sectors, and most of them are very often exposed to the sun or the temperatures, because they need to work open. For example, the construction workers, the agricultural workers, and they may not be able to work for the longer hours whenever there is a heat wave like a condition. And even if they work for a minimal hours under the sun or in open spaces, during the heat wave condition, they would be exposed to the heat waves, and it would actually cause heat stress. It affects the kidneys of the people, liver, brain, and it can even lead to the death as well. So those people who are working in open spaces, so those people who are working in unorganized sector or informal sector, so they will be more and more vulnerable here. And there are some vulnerable groups such as elderly, women, outdoor workers, and poor communities. So these are also the communities which are considered as more vulnerable to heat wave. And similarly, economic and livelihood impacts, particularly heat wave reduces agricultural productivity, and it also kills the livestock as well, and it can even lower the work hours, especially among the informal sector workers. So the estimated loss expected is around 3% to 5% of the GDP. In 2023, 6% of India's work hours were lost due to the heat stress, and it also impacts the economic growth of any country, economic development, and it also have a worst social impact on the vulnerable communities or vulnerable populations. However, apart from that, we should also talk about the social inequity as heat waves, right? So heat waves disproportionately affect the marginalized sections of the society, migrants, women, elderly, children. So all these different categories of people will be worst impacted because of the heat waves. So however, there are certain challenges which are actually associated with heat waves, right? So what are the challenges which are actually associated with heat waves? So inadequate implementation of the heat wave action plans. So a number of states are actually put in place the heat wave action plans, but they fail to implement these heat wave action plans. So poor execution is a problem, poor implementation is a problem, and lack of comprehensive data and incomplete heat related morbidity and mortality statistics coming from number of states. And in fact, so we should actually have a valid data. So valid data will help us identify the potential hotspots so that we could actually target those areas and reduce the vulnerabilities of the people. But here the problem is we are lacking the comprehensive data. However, the urban vulnerabilities, particularly the confined spaces, dense housing, actually amplify the risks in poor neighborhoods. So infrastructure gaps such as insufficient cooling, shelters, public water points, ORS availability. So these are also the other problems, the other challenges which are existing. And similarly, limited awareness, public education on heat safety. So this also remains patchy, right? So color coded warnings are also issued to indicate the severity of these heat wave and heat wave like conditions. So what should be the way forward in this context? So we need to adopt both short term as well as the long term measures in this context, right? So when we talk about the short term measures, so there is a need to strengthen heat wave action plans, update state and city level plans, factoring in humidity, local vulnerabilities, etc. So similarly, there is a need for early warning systems, adopt heat health alert systems using both day and night temperatures. And apart from that, immediate public health actions and ensure availability of drinking water, ORS, and even a staggered work hours are also very important. And targeted advisories, including providing localized and socially contextual heat advisories. And there is a need for certain social long-term measures, urban planning reforms such as promoting cool roofing, green spaces, better building materials, establish summer shelters for the vulnerable populations is also very, very important. A skill development is also another very important area. So for that, we need to train the workforce for heat resilient construction, urban management, and insurance coverage is also very important because this could provide social security and social safety nets for the people, and also it could cover the wage losses due to the extreme heat events. And similarly, there is a need to coordinate the climate action across sectors for a sustainable adaptation, right? So this is all in this discussion, and thank you so much. And please tell me whether heat wave action plans are part of the list of disasters recognized by the National Disaster Management Act or not, and answer this in the comment section. So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.